there's a strong temptation to always see your opponent, the person you're arguing against, as somehow necessarily wrong or at fault. When in fact, what's usually happening is that the person is in the same situation you are. They're struggling with a difficult situation that arouses their emotions. They don't have all the information they need. You don't have all the information you need. You will both make mistakes in the debate. You'll both get things wrong. And so you proceed with respect and empathy. You recognize that they're not just a thinking robot, that they're a person with needs and vulnerabilities and anxieties. So you think maybe the person I'm arguing with is getting these things wrong because they're just desperately worried about the people that they love. Or maybe you're thinking, well, this person is jumping to conclusions because they're so afraid of the risks. And empathy and respect of that sort is important because it can make us go slower, to take more care with our arguments, not just to launch in with dramatic claims like, you're wrong, or very abstract claims like, haven't you seen this latest bit of evidence or this latest piece of research? It's to recognize that people's thinking and reasoning is bound up with the wider structure of their life, with their concerns, their anxieties, their worries. And I suppose the lesson there is when you engage with a person in a debate, you really have to engage with the whole of that person, their emotions, their feelings, their interpersonal relationships. That's what you have to do. And it makes the conversations often slower, and they don't probably go as quickly as you'd like them to, but they will be proceeding on a basis of considerateness and kindness and respect. You're recognizing that these aren't just interesting abstract issues to debate or discuss, they're bound up with how people live their lives. And whenever you're dealing with how people live their lives, you should tread carefully.
Hmm.
I like that a lot.
And you probably aren't going to see somebody change their mind in the middle of a debate, right?
Not often in that immediate way. And that's one problem with many debates. Some people rush through a debate. They think that, well, once I give this person this argument or this bit of evidence, they'll change their mind straight away, just like that. But changing a mind is not usually like that. It's much more like changing a relationship with somebody. It takes time and repeated exposure. It depends on trust, which you were talking about earlier. And I think some people go wrong in debates because they think, once I give this person my brilliant argument or this excellent piece of counter evidence, they'll just change their mind, snap,
Mm-hmm.
just like that. But that's rarely the case. Because when people are thinking about ideas, they're not just asking, does this make sense? Or can I understand this? They're also asking, how would this change my life? How would this change my feelings? How would this change how I live? And that sort of thinking takes time. And that's why you shouldn't expect someone to just change their mind straight away in these radical ways. It takes long, sustained, often difficult, but always trustful conversations.
And this trust, this building of trust, can happen between two people when they're patient and empathetic with one another. But in order for uh, in order for human systems to shift in a positive direction, humans also have to trust in those structures as well. But there hasn't been a central structure that humans trust in for a long time. Maybe since the decrease of religiosity across the world, where there's no longer the central authority that people can turn to and people can believe. So how does that get rebuilt?
Well, I think people have quite complex relations of trust with different institutions and practices and different communities of people. So, for example, I think very few people have a blunt attitude of unconditional trust. That seems extraordinarily rare. What usually happens is that people have certain degrees of trust that are tied into the behavior of institutions. And that means that people can exercise a degree of control over who they trust. So, a good example here is when you look at governments. Now, in most human societies, or at least the one that I live in, the government changes regularly. The people in charge change every few years through events called elections. Now, when governments change, people change the degree of trust. For example, you might think, well, I don't trust that political party, I don't trust that leader. And so they alter their trust. And that means that people can exercise some degree of control over who and what and how much they trust. For example, they might ask, well, I used to trust these people because their advice was always very good. When I followed their advice, my life tended to go better. But lately, their advice has been bad advice. And so they don't abandon trust straight away, but they do sort of kind of hold it at an arm's length and say, well, maybe I should rethink this. Like, why are they giving me bad advice? Are they giving me bad advice, or is this something else? And those negotiations of trust are very, very difficult, partly because it takes a lot of effort to just stop and think about the trust you put in institutions. It's hard enough to live life, let alone reflect on it. But that's where it's very useful to think about trust in terms of communities. So often, if I'm having a crisis of trust in an institution or some community, I don't just sit by myself and think about it. I ask other people. I have friends or colleagues or other people I can reach out to help me with these reflections. And I think that's one thing that human communities need very much. In order to maintain and update their attitudes of trust, they need to engage with other people. They need to be able to trust those people. They need to make sure that the people they're asking are diverse and critical and self-reflective. They need critical pushback as well. Criticism is crucial. So not just asking only the people who agree with you or only the people who share your views. You need a diversity of critical perspectives. Some people have this naturally out of luck or design. Some people don't. But what would matter here is that issues of trust and so on are always going to be dependent on the diversity and quality of your relationships with other people. Now, if you don't have that background social support, it's much, much, much more difficult. One thing that you need then is strong social communities and strong social relationships.
Yeah, I was going to say it's an interesting time on Earth because for the first time it seems like a lot of distrusting people can all get together and sort of reinforce their distrust, particularly with institutional narratives and academic science, things like that.
Yeah, how does social media play into the misanthropic perspective?
I think the overwhelming perspective is that social media confirms all the misanthropic verdicts.
Uh-oh.
So I suppose I remember, I'm young enough to remember when social media was first being introduced. And the very optimistic rhetoric was that this would facilitate new conversations, new open-mindedness. It would make people more inquisitive. It would help us to learn and form new connections with people. And to a degree, it does that.
Sure.
Social media, I form good relationships with other people through social media, including people I never would have met. So I remember when, for example, a social media network called Facebook first arrived in my country. And the hope of many people was that it would make people friendlier and more open. It would help us form new friendships with strangers. It would help us get new information. And to a degree, it's done that. I learn lots from social media. I have great friendships through social media, including friendships I could never keep up if it wasn't for social media. For example, people who live in distant countries. But at the same time, social media also encourages certain vices as well. For example, it can make people more aggressive, more antagonistic. It can actually lead us to disengage from other people. And the misanthrope will say, well, this is what happens with everything that human beings develop. There's always some possibilities for good, and some of those good possibilities will be realized. But there are also many, many possibilities for corruption. Everything can be subverted by human beings. If you can find a way to make it vicious or aggressive or dogmatic, human beings will find a way of doing that.